Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. What if the biggest impact you have as a leader isn't the strategy you set, but the subtle signals you leave behind in every interaction? In this episode, I'm joined by Paul Kinkaid, former British Army officer, leadership coach, and author of Forensic Leadership. Paul brings a fascinating idea from forensic science into the world of leadership. Every contact leaves an imprint. Over time, those small moments, the way you listen, the way you respond, the way you make decisions, shape how your leadership is experienced across an organization. And right now, as organizations grow faster, teams become more distributed, and trust becomes harder to build. Understanding those signals has never been more important. In this conversation, we explore how great leaders create trust, clarity, and psychological safety, often through the smallest behaviors that most leaders overlook. I'm your host, Adam Horner, coach to CTOs from startups to enterprises, helping you lead with clarity, confidence, and strategic impact. If you feel like you're figuring it out the hard way, you're not alone. That's exactly why I created the CTO Playbook, a podcast and platform built for tech leaders just like you. Explore coaching, cohorts, and ways to stay connected at thectoplaybook.com, where you can build your own playbook for your path at your pace. In this conversation, Paul explains why leadership isn't just about decisions or strategy, it's about the signals you send every day and how those signals shape trust, culture, and performance inside your organization. So let's meet Paul and explore the leadership signals most leaders never realize they're sending. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to talk about leadership today, as we often do, but not in the usual sense of strategy frameworks or management theory, because your work focuses on something I found really intriguing, this idea that leadership leaves traces behind it, almost like a forensic trail inside an organization.
Yeah, it actually comes from forensic science. One of the central themes of forensic science is the low card exchange principle that says every contact leaves a trace. So you're absolutely right. We are communicating now virtually, but it's contact and we're leaving a trace on one another. Hopefully a positive green trace.
Definitely. Let's leave a positive trace. I like the idea of that one. But before we get into any of that though, what I'd love to do is sort of start with the person behind the work. And so when people meet you today, they see the coach, the author, the leadership advisor. But where did your journey actually start, Paul?
And my leadership journey started actually at school when I was a young boy. I was in the Cub Scouts and then I was an army cadet. I was kind of uniform and army barmy as a child. I picked up the sticks at 5 years old. The sticks were guns. I just lacked the imagination to put them down and joined the army. But I seemed to do pretty well. I got to a senior appointment, if you could call it a senior appointment, in the Cub Scouts. I became a company sergeant major in cadets. In school, I became the head boy. And in sports teams, I was a senior member of the team, if not the captain. So I think an element of that is physiology. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'5". I've always been big. So there was always that sort of, that physiological advantage, if you can call it advantage, presence, I guess. So it goes all the way back to then. And as I say, from a very young age, I wanted to be a soldier. And then that transferred into actually wanting to be an officer within the army. And leadership just became a thing. It was just something that I knew I was going to try and aim for. So either I found it or it found me.
Yeah, either way, you wasted no time at all. Straight out the blocks, sprinting straight into that role straight away. Yeah. And that's interesting about the physiological aspect, because I think it's something where it not only does it end up with this sort of expectation that you'll lead, but also that expectation works two ways round, in that sort of puts pressure on you very early. Did you feel that pressure, or is that something that you welcomed?
I think by the time leadership became kind of real, i.e. military leadership, I was well used to it, predominantly from basketball and rugby. Physiology helps. Being a tall guy helps. Being a big guy on the rugby pitch helps. And so I think I'd embraced it by that point. Earlier in life, I was very self-conscious about being tall. I'd see a tall guy walking down the street and think, flipping heck, he's massive. And then I'd be, not head and shoulders, but I'd be taller than him. And I'd find that quite confronting, to be honest, when I was younger.
That's interesting, isn't it? And was there an early experience where you sort of realized leadership had a deeper impact on you than you, I guess, first thought or first realized?
There's no particular single time that I recognize. I've gone back to try and explore my origin story like many people do when they get to sort of my stage in life. But there were just lots of little times. I enjoyed leading. I enjoyed helping other people. And I think at its root, that's probably what it is helping others to develop. That's what really drives me. I love those light bulb moments and those aha moments, if you can call them that.
In others, when they sort of realize how to...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. And so were there any sort of early influences, people or environments? You mentioned the Scouts, you mentioned the Army, that sort of shaped how you think today about your leadership?
There were a couple of individuals. I remember one adult instructor, they were called, at cadets, who had been a regular soldier, and he came out and he had it all. When you're sort of at that age, early teens, and your value set is being formed and you're impressionable, his turnout was always impeccable. He always held himself upright, and he had what I now know, looking back, something called leadership presence. When he walked in a room, he had presence, he had gravitas. He wasn't big, but the manner in which he held himself, which is what I now talk to clients about as well, it just meant that broadly, when he spoke, people listened, and he seemed to speak with authority as well.
Right. So that's something you sort of looked at, respected, and sort of thought, well, that's something that I can copy. I can use as a role model.
Yeah, absolutely. And role modeling is a great thing when you're starting, but it can become quite dangerous as well, because you end up trying to be someone else rather than authentically be yourself. So absolutely take elements of other people that you would like to emulate. But I think emulate is the key word, not simulate, because then you're trying to role play being someone else.
Yeah, so you're playing at leadership rather than doing it. Yeah, so I was very lucky as I was coming through. I had a leader who put me into a leadership position and said, here you go, I'm going to put you in with a group of other people who are also new to leadership. And he mentored the lot of us together as a leadership team and sort of shaped us in that way. Were there, I mean, other than this one person that you sort of saw and were able to emulate, were there others who actually actively shaped your leadership journey as you went through?
Yeah, much later on, when you in the British Army, you as an officer, you spend 44 weeks at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and you are trained by predominantly soldiers who you will latterly command, and that shaped me in a really profound way, because they come with a huge breadth and depth of experience, and so as long as you've got a modicum of emotional intelligence and humility, you bow down to their experience. You are senior to them in military terms. They call you sir, you call them by their rank. And there's a great adage that the sergeant major at Sandhurst says, I will call you sir and you will call me sir. The only difference is you will mean it, which is really interesting, right? It just demonstrates that there is this mutual respect, but there's also an unofficial hierarchy there as well. So all of the directing staff were great role models to follow. And the time at which I joined, I went to Sandhurst in 1997. The vast majority of them had been through Northern Ireland and the early part of the Balkans, and some had even been through the Falkland Islands as well. So in terms of leading in conflict, they were there, they'd done it. And so you could take those lessons from them really easily and follow them exceptionally.
Yeah, and so those leaders are people who've been through the crucible of leadership. And of course, the British Army is well known for having an exceptional leadership program. And so therefore, do you think as you went into that leadership program that you sort of had your eyes open that this is an education of a lifetime? Or were you sort of just following along the track and sort of, well, I'm just going to get the most out of it that I can? But did you really appreciate what you were getting at that time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, I'd done my research beforehand as well, and I knew what I'd be getting. As I said earlier on, I was army barmy. I knew what Sandhurst was about. I'd done a huge amount of reading about it. And I wasn't one of those know-it-all. I went in there having experience of cadets and all that kind of stuff, so I broadly knew how to wear the uniform and lace my boots, but that was about it. So I'd help others where I could. But yeah, absolutely. It's a special kind of person who doesn't realise that they're getting the education of a lifetime, and they will probably fall by the wayside quite rapidly.
Because there is an elimination process, isn't there, through Sandhurst? Not everybody makes it through. It's not like going to university where if you start it, as long as you keep going, you're definitely going to get through. There is actually a bar to meet, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can get what they call back terms. So you have 3 terms. And if you don't quite meet the standard, but they think you will if you go through it again, you can go back to the previous term. You can be kicked out, essentially. You haven't met the standard and you're kicked out. But a surprising number get there and go, actually, this isn't for me. I don't want it. Probably because of in the early stages, it's quite challenging. The training is quite challenging. It's a change in culture from what you were used to it's an introduction, quite a harsh introduction to the culture that you're going to face in the military. Although it's quite loud when you first start, there's quite a lot of direction given. And the field army is not like that. It's in Hollywood, military people are loud, shouty, barky, giving orders all the time. And actually, as we may explore later on, leadership isn't like that, especially if you want people to come to you with their problems. And we have a duty of care to look after people as leaders, don't we?
Indeed.
And you don't do that from shouting.
No, yeah, and shouting was one of those challenges where I often see that as a very quick anti-pattern to look at. And so this is an example of some of the misconceptions, mistakes, and some of the reality of leadership under pressure. It's not always pretty, and it certainly isn't how it looks in Hollywood, which is a really good reference, I think, for that. And one thing I find fascinating when talking to leaders is that the lessons that kind of really shape us actually rarely come from the textbooks. They usually come from moments where things don't go as planned, where things end up being a surprise or a shock. And having spent all that time under those high pressure environments, I imagine you probably got some good stories of way of sort of exploring some of those surprises and shocks that shape how you think today.
Yeah, some are from my own lived experience, and others are for experiences that I have witnessed. So I think if I share one that I've witnessed to start with, which was one of my peers at Sandhurst, graduated, went through their infantry training. They went to the infantry. I went to an engineering unit to start with. And they turned up after all their training and they'd lost the humility somewhere. So they turned up and there had been a sergeant running the platoon, and a sergeant is 3 ranks up: private, lance corporal, corporal, sergeant. And every platoon has a platoon sergeant and a platoon commander. The sergeant is probably about 8 to 12 years in, maybe 12 to 15 years experience. And this young second lieutenant, still wet behind the ears, turns up and says, right, I'm running the platoon now, I'm here, and just both feet in the mouth at the same time. Unfortunately, they then went out on a social and some gritty lessons were learnt with beer, and he allegedly got a bit of a slap when they were out downtown by the soldiers, and whether he learned the lesson or not, I don't know. Let's hope so.
So the good point there is unfounded arrogance is rarely going to be repaid with a good situation or a good experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Most good leaders will go in 30 days to 90 days, just look, feel, listen, absorb what's going on, what can I learn, who are the key people, who are the stakeholders, and where can I have the best effect. We're looking for low-hanging fruit, aren't we? As well as sort of slightly more strategic areas that we might want to have a longer term influence in. But he lacked that.
And I think there's an element there as well that's interesting. It's also translatable when you switch companies as a leader, because sometimes you bring not just unfound arrogance, but you bring previous conceptions, you could bring previous playbooks, previous ideas about how to do things, and sort of trying to impose them on the target organization you join with other people who've been there often a lot longer, maybe not 12 to 15 years, but certainly 3 to 5 years is fairly common. You can have a similar kind of reception if you go the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I still strongly believe the best set of eyes in an organization are the new set, because they see where things are perhaps gone stale or aren't quite as effective as they might be. But there's a way of introducing the fact of what you've seen, isn't it? It's suggestions rather than tell. It's one of the key themes that I talk about is noticing. And I think the ability to notice and then communicate that effectively is a really important trait for a leader to have, rather than go in all guns blazing, if you pardon the expression, and tell people the way it is. There's not much space for tell, I don't think. There's time for direction occasionally, but again, we might explore later on where that works and where it doesn't.
Yeah, there's one simple phrase I always remember was told to me by that leadership coach. He sort of took me under his wing and told me, he said, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been around for a long, long time, that phrase, but we haven't changed. So, it's important.
And hopefully really it's nice and simple and memorable too.
Yeah, exactly.
So I kind of interrupted you before because you said there were sort of 2 things you were going to talk about, and I let you talk about one and interrupted you.
Yeah, I think my own lived experience came much later on, whereby I would try and get stuck in, or I'd get overexcited, right? And I would get stuck into everywhere where I thought I could have an influence. And I was sort of casting a bit of a shadow around places. So rather than stop and be a bit more intentional, think, right, where do I need to be in order to have the influence I need to have? I was like an excited puppy. I can do that. I'll do this. I'll do that. And I inadvertently ended up treading on people's toes whose role it was to do that. And rather than stay in my lane, now there's value in collaboration. Of course there is. I'm not talking don't collaborate, but people were paid to do a job and I was actively, inadvertently treading on their toes. And it came to a bit of a head. We were on the ranges doing a live firing practiced attack on an exercise. So there's, real bullets flying towards the targets. And I started doing a replenishment demand on the radio because we were running low. And the sergeant who I spoke about earlier, platoon sergeant, platoon commander, the sergeant's tank, if you like, pulled up next to mine. And I felt this tap on my leg, looked down, and he's down there, beckoned me down and educated me in no uncertain terms using some pretty hefty Anglo-Saxon around the fact that my job is to think about the tactics and move forward and think about the troops and the welfare and career development. His is to look after the troops in terms of supplies and all that kind of stuff. So it was a harsh lesson learnt in a harsh environment in Bosnia, freezing cold, but it's one that I carry with me. If it's not my job to do it, that I can help, maybe ask first if I can offer some help. And I still use that sort of approach in my coaching as well. Would it be useful if I was to suggest something here rather than go in and say, oh, I know what you should do, which is generally unhelpful, and the client is probably doing better levels of processing than I can offer at that moment.
So harsh, but very memorable in that it made you reflect and change what you're doing in those situations.
I think the best lessons are quite long-term memorable ones. 2 ears, 1 mouth. That's a fair time ago, I would imagine, possibly decades, and yet you still remember it. So it's a key lesson and one that I definitely carry with me now.
That's a good one. So staying in your lane, I think, is very much the military expression. Where I was working in another organization, there was a leader. Funny that you mentioned the puppy, because it's exactly what this guy reminds me of. And he used to sort of reach across the organization. So he'd give orders sort of diagonally across to other people's reports, and it had the same effect. They felt rattled, they felt undervalued, and they felt as though they'd been undermined effectively. Mm. Similar kind of situation, I think.
I think bypassing other key leaders and key stakeholders is a mistake. Sometimes there's, in times of extreme crisis or extreme urgency, it might be required. And I think it's understood across the board if that is the case, and you're dealing with something that is incredibly time sensitive. But those are rare. And so therefore, I think just a cursory nod. Adam, do you mind if I speak to your team about this? And you might wish to shape that, of course, and then say, crack on, but please bear in mind that they've also got this project on. So it's really important to communicate laterally as well as vertically.
Yeah, and getting permission is a very good model, I think, for many things. You can overdo it at times, but I think most of the time it's better to ask for permission rather than begging for forgiveness later on.
I think so. Again, apart from where there is a time-sensitive, time-critical,
urgent and safety,
urgent, or safety, exactly that.
I mean, that's a pretty good example. Were there any sort of leadership habits that you once believed were effective, but you kind of later on realized, actually, this is causing more problems than I'm actually solving in this situation?
Yeah, early on got stuck into the almost arrogant. I don't think I quite got there. I don't know. Ask my parents, I guess they'll tell you. Down there, I've been trained at the best leadership academy, arguably, in the world. And therefore, I should give direction. I should give orders. In any situation, I should do this or I should do that. And it didn't take long. I'd say probably 18 to 24 months before I then started thinking, well, hang on a minute. There are a lot of people around me who have got an awful lot more experience. In order to lead, you don't have to speak. You can ask and listen rather than think and tell. So it was almost a diametrically opposed approach to leadership whereby I don't think I grew to be slightly arrogant because I was told at the start, you're really good. And then you start to believe that. When I was still, I was in my mid-20s, still quite impressionable, still very, very keen to progress and as quickly as I possibly could. And then, as I say, about 24, 36 months in, I thought, it's not about speed, it's about quality. So let's just slow down, do the jobs well, speak to more people around me. And the learning curve accelerated massively. And I took on a hugely different skill set and I listened a whole lot more. And I guess looking back, that's probably when the coaching element of me started and was born was ask people what they think, gather opinion. And yes, I remained responsible and accountable for the decisions that were made, but those decisions were highly informed by other brains, rather than being the strong, all-knowing, decision-making leader that we're led to believe that leaders are.
Yeah, I mean, there's still this image that persists from sort of, I mean, I think it's coming from the Victorian era, but it's definitely the command and control approach to leadership, which is mostly out of date and rarely used effectively anymore because the world is a different place and because people are people rather than being automatons.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from my career history, which people might find as quite juxtaposed, that command and control doesn't work. It works in very, very extreme cases. So when you're in crisis, we've mentioned crisis a couple of times already, but when you're in crisis, and even then only for a very short period of time, right, you do this, you do that, you do that. And then you start to gather information. I work with emergency services as well. And the commanders, like on the fire ground, when the incident commander turns up, one of the first things they do is gather the information from everybody, because that information and occasionally that challenge leads to better decisions.
Yeah, sometimes there's a moment to stop the bleeding first, but then it's figure out what's going on. Yeah, absolutely. As when you're listening to that, it feels like those experiences must have created a kind of, I guess, pattern recognition over time. Yeah. But at some point, there must have been this sort of the moment where it began to coalesce into these ideas of what forensic leadership, and it must have sort of take shape. So I'm just curious about when that began to first sort of click together for you.
Yeah. So early on, I decided that whilst all army officers lead, I was going to make leadership my sort of central thing, if you like, because I was so fascinated in what made people follow certain people and follow begrudgingly other people because there was rank and they had to, but they would approach others. And then I came across a guy called Neil Powell, who was an ex-Royal Military Police Special Investigations branch, like a detective, if you like. And he introduced me to this piece of work by a guy called Dr. Edmond Locard, a French guy, the father of forensic science. And he said, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, he has this Locard exchange principle that says every contact leaves a trace. And whilst we may never have heard of that, we understand it implicitly because we've seen Silent Witness or CIS or the news. And we understand that when we touch something, we leave a fingerprint. And when we walk across a carpet, the carpet leaves fibres on us. And we understand that from criminal activity as well. Not that we're criminals, of course, I hasten to add. It struck me at that point, and Neil as well, that if you lifted that up and dropped it into the human relationship domain, it remains constant. Every contact leaves a trace. So we can leave interactions with one another with a positive feeling, which I call green traces, or a negative feeling, which I call red traces. I choose to put that into the leadership domain, and because I lack imagination, I've called it forensic leadership. But also, red and green might sound binary, but of course it's not, because there's a whole
spectrum
sliding scale and spectrum of green, from a very light green of, he seems okay or she seems okay, all the way through to I will follow that person to the end of the earth. And then the same is true with the opposite of, I'm a bit uncomfortable with what he or she just said, through to deep, toxic bullying, harassment, almost evil activity at work, which is probably illegal as well. So yeah, there's a scale, and we can measure those traces as well, and we do.
And when you do this, I mean, one of the things I always look at when I'm, for example, recruiting is I say, well, you've got 4 choices. You go and you have this conversation with somebody, you ask them questions, they ask you questions, and at the end of it, you make a decision. And I always say, well, there's 4 choices. You've got a strong hire, a strong no hire, which are the 2 extreme options. You've got hire, no hire, which is yes or no, effectively.
Yeah.
But there is no on the fence. Do you, when you look at these forensic traces and the sort of assessments of that, is there a neutral middle option there that you look at?
No.
Same thing. Okay.
No, there isn't. We score it simplistically -5 to +5, but there is no 0, because as a leader, if you're leaving no trace, by default, that's a red, because you should have leadership presence. You should be leaving a trace. You should ideally be leaving a positive one. through leadership presence and that physicality that we spoke about, the physiology of leadership and the psychology of leadership as well, of course. So I think strongly that if you're not leaving a trace, that bland vacuum is by default a red.
And so when you first started looking at this, beginning to apply this thinking to the way that you assessed leadership, what was the sort of journey that you went through in sort of looking at this, understanding, picking it as a methodology, beginning to apply it? I mean, was it always smooth from the beginning, or were there some sort of trial and error at the beginning as you're sort of figuring out how to make this apply to leadership and the analysis of leadership?
I wouldn't say necessarily, it wasn't always smooth, but there were no real sort of train crash moments. It was just, okay, does it really fit there? And some of those times when you think, okay, am I overcomplicating it? So actually, over the years, the model has actually become simpler and more accessible because, I said, we could do this and we could do that. And I had that typical new idea, almost puppy again, to use that phrase.
Do all the things.
We could do this and we could do that and we could do that. And that would be great but actually, I prefer to use a tool that's there to do one job and one job only. So our tool, Dacto app, measures this forensic leadership capability and it does it from the bottom up. It could do it out to the sides, to peers, but I feel very strongly, actually, and this comes from leading leaders and having to write performance reviews on leaders, that you only ever get a partial truth when you're trying to do a performance review on a leader from, if they are a direct report of yours. Even if you do skip level meetings, you're still only getting a partial truth because you're the big boss. And so from my military time, trying to report on other officers who I was commanding and they were commanding troops, it became actually quite challenging to effectively measure their leadership capability. And I feel very strongly that 360-degree appraisals don't work. And the reason for that, and I'm very happy for people to challenge me on it, is that in order to get a response from that 360-degree network, the question set is so bland that the responses are almost meaningless.
Right.
I would much rather get a very targeted question set from the bottom up, because in my mind, the most important people in a leadership relationship, are the led. And so we ask the led, what are the traces that are being left upon you across a number of different domains? And then, of course, you ask a different set if you want to go out to peers. And we tend to do one-to-one interviews with line managers rather than a third tool that looks up. So we've got Dacto app that looks down. We're developing Dacto peer that looks out.
Right.
And we combine that with very human one-to-one interviews to get data and qualitative data as well. So quantitative and qualitative. So we can sort of start to triangulate that data and identify themes and trends.
So at what point then did you decide that this idea was worth developing into the tool, into the platform, into the theory that you now teach to others?
Yeah, that was on leaving the army. I left in 2017, which is just, in fact, 9 years ago now. Yeah, goodness me.
Almost a decade.
Yeah, I've been out the army for almost half the time I was in it. That's incredible because it feels like yesterday, so many things. I realised that I needed, if I was going to leave the army and make a successful leadership development consultancy, then I wanted it to be different to all of the others out there. And there are a lot of veterans in that space. There are a lot of, ex-commercial and business leaders in that space. And I wanted to have something that made me and us unique. And in the process of leaving, this whole forensic thing started to just pull together in my mind. I thought, there's probably a book here. So the act of pulling the book together really reinforced how I would go to market with that as well.
So the book was the thing that came first then, rather than anything else. And you sort of sat down and developed the book first.
No, the ideas came first, but the book cemented the ideas and actually removed an awful lot of the complexity. Because the way I view leadership is that this is not a dark art. Anyone who has the will to lead can lead. And so I wanted to make a philosophy that is accessible and sustainable. And once you become aware of the red and green traces, you see them absolutely everywhere. In fact, my son is now a police officer and he's 22. When he was, I think, about 17, we're at a family event and I started over-explaining something to him. And he went, "Dad, you're leaving red traces all over me, man." and threw my own theory back in my face, which was absolutely brilliant. Everyone creased up laughing.
That must have been a real
But it
parenting
just
moment. That.
shows the applicable nature. It's accessible, it's sustainable. It doesn't need to be in a work leadership space. We're talking about relationships here. And as I said earlier, I just choose to put it in the leadership domain. But parenting is leadership by other name, isn't it, ultimately?
Yeah, there's a very common reflection that I love, which is because a lot of people I work with are in startups. And so startups are like this little tiny thing that you try and develop into something that's going to grow massively. And people often talk about searching for product market fit. And there was another, when I was first a founder, there was another founder working on a very similar app very close by. And he had this great phrase that I picked up and carried with me ever since. He said, raising kids is just like trying to find person world fit rather than product market fit.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
That's almost as good as your son throwing back the red traces in you. That's something memorable, and also I imagine a proud moment, even though it's slightly humiliating as well.
Yeah, no, I'm so thick-skinned now. I think I'm just skin. So it kind of bounced off, but it was one of those very proud moments, and also like a eureka moment of, yeah, this works.
This works. Yeah,
if other people are throwing it back at me in this setting, it works. It just works. It was one of those sort of, by Jove, he's got it moments.
Yeah. And going from there to sort of positive organizational outcomes, real measurable outcomes.
Yeah.
Where was sort of the first moment when you realized, okay, this isn't just that people get it, that people can then actually reflect it back to me, but actually this is making a tangible difference?
In all honesty, that was probably post-COVID, because up until COVID, things were going well and they were progressing in a nice way, but things were coming to me. And so naively, this whole working for yourself, starting a business thing was easy, right? This is easy. And then COVID happened and I lost every client overnight because training budgets, you couldn't do what we needed to do. And so I spent probably 24, 48 hours licking my wounds and then thought, right, okay, how do I get back into the marketplace? And I realized then that all of my adult life, I'd been preparing for operating in or training others to operate in those VUCA conditions, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous conditions. And the world was facing all four of those concurrently, arguably for the first time since the end of the Second World War, arguably, certainly for the Western world.
Definitely, yeah.
And so I went back to the market with, look, I've done this. And they were like, okay, that's great, but how do we actually embed it? And that's when this thing that we've now called the Forensic Leadership Pathway came together, which was, we spend time understanding the organization, the sector, and the pain points. So you come to us and tell us what your symptoms that you're experiencing are.
Right.
We then diagnose what we think they are as well. Because, if you go to the doctor and say, look, I've got a really sore leg, the doctor's not going to say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll amputate it then. You'd go, whoa, hang on a second. Aren't you going to do some tests first? So that's what we do. We go in and do some tests and come back with a diagnosis that either supports your hypothesis to start with or challenges it in some way. And then we go into the pathway of delivering what we deliver with organizations, which is an element of co-creation in there as well. And we deliver things that are underpinned by the forensic leadership philosophy, because it's a vehicle from which so many other elements and dynamics of leadership can be brought into. We use the philosophy as a vehicle, not the be-all and end-all.
And I think that's one of those interesting points, isn't it? Because all organizations have a goal and leadership is part of the path to that goal. And one of the reasons this whole topic resonates with me as a CTO is that technology organizations are, I think, extremely sensitive to leadership behavior. It's one of those areas, I think, where you can sort of see the impact quite magnified compared to some other parts of organizations that can be quite resilient to leadership and to leadership missteps. But I think small leaderships have quite an impact on engineering organizations. And so when you're looking inside organizations today, so what sort of leadership traces tend to cause the biggest problems? The ones where you end up with sort of the biggest disparity between the hypothesis that they have and your diagnosis? That's
a great point. What we tend to find is that, one of the biggest things is trust. So a friend of mine, Andy Edwards, looks at this and he's got some data around that 95% of leaders say they are trusted and trustworthy, only 16% of their teams trust them. So that's an immediate disparity and a huge and worrying element. That if you've got such a huge group in the organization that think they are trustworthy that much, and normally it's through just simple communication mechanisms. So what we find is we look at all of these different elements. So as I say, one of them, for example, is day-to-day leadership behavior is something that we look at.
Right.
And therefore, where the picture doesn't match the sound and the lips aren't synced, the hierarchy are being told, I'm leading like this, I'm doing that. And then you ask the lead and they go, no, that's not happening. So what we find quite often is because of a lack of psychological safety at the higher levels or a lack of courage where people can go, actually, I don't think that's going to work. You get something called consent and evade, which is one of the 10 diseases of leadership put together by the late Professor Richard Holmes. One of them is consent and evade, where they go, yeah, great idea, boss. Yeah, we can do that. And then as soon as they leave the boardroom, it's like, that'll never work. We're not going to do that. And so we find that at somewhere in the various strata and levels of an organization, there's a mismatch in communication styles. And that's where leadership drag, dilution of leadership messaging starts to occur. So we find that in our global executive team clients, but we also find it in our rapid growth startups.
So that's interesting. There's a similar kind of traits in two kinds of organizations that most people would think have as much in common as chalk and cheese.
Yeah, but for quite different reasons.
Okay.
A lot of it is deep-seated behavioral or cultural issues in the large organizations brought on by hierarchy. And in the rapid growth, it's because of that growth, and there's a tipping point around about 20, 24 people, whereby departments and functions start being formed, and the founder's relationship with the staff starts to change because there's one step in between.
Yeah.
And so leadership messaging becomes diluted, and Paul says, hang on, that's not my leadership mechanism. So you get friction at that point. So when we work with the founder-led to leader-led transition, which I love doing, we start talking about leadership systems within the other systems. Lots of rapid growth organizations understand they need systems, processes to sustain that growth. Absolutely correct. But they tend to overlook the human systems, which we call leadership systems, within that.
That's very similar to the kinds of things that I encounter when I'm also coaching leaders in those fast growth organizations. There's sort of two things that happen in my experience. One of them is where founders particularly will sort of still think as though they're sat around a table with 5 of their mates putting this thing together, whereas it's now a sort of 25, 30 person organization with a couple of layers in it. And they kind of forget that you no longer can get away with saying something once. You need to repeat it multiple times, as you do in any other organization, because people don't hear things the first time and don't understand it the second time. And it's only about the 8th or 9th time that things actually begin to sink in. And so that's one style that kind of needs to change over time that I find that, and clearly that must leave fairly obvious traces when you go start looking in those organizations. And
yeah, definitely. The founding group, whatever that is, it might be a couple of people, or it might be a small group of people who think this is going to be a great idea, let's give it a go. And it takes off, right? So they're doing really well. And then all of a sudden, other people start to come in, and you start to approach well, lots of people call it accidental leadership. You've got these people, you're having to manage people, lead people. You've got to start to, you're not just chatting to mates, you've got to communicate in a really compelling narrative that demonstrates that everyone can understand what part they play in your plan. Because if they don't get it, they don't get it. And therefore there's going to be friction. So it's really interesting that, again, rapid growth, because the systems, all of a sudden, Paul has to start putting in a leave pass or a holiday form. We didn't used to do that. We just took it whenever we wanted. And sometimes it becomes clear that those who founded the organization are not the ones to lead it beyond that initial startup and rapid growth, because they're just not excited by the systems and what a lot of them would view as the mundanity of a larger organization, because it's not as agile, it's not as flexible, and it's not as exciting. And so those individuals often are best placed, right, what's the next idea? They
Yes.
start something else. And they might not fall into the category that a lot of people call completer finisher.
No, but it's often also those people who are very good at 0 to 1, but 1 to 10, 10 to 100, they kind of tune out. They get bored. It's too much for them.
Yeah.
And it's often, I describe it as the difference between building an idea, building a product, building a service, and building a company, which when you think about a company, it is multiple people and you're leading people rather than leading concepts, ideas, and stuff that's easy, much harder to sort of stamp on.
But that's okay. You know, lots of people speak about that as if it's a bad thing, but that self-awareness and the realization that I've got it to this, but I'm not the person, you know, what's got us here will not get us there. And I got us here, we got us here, but we will not get us there. That's a strength, surely, to have that level of self-awareness and humility, which is that word again, to go, do you know what? I'm going to hand over to you. They might be a shareholder, they might be a partner, they might step aside to be innovation lead or whatever that might be, or communications, or they might just step away entirely and get bought out. And that's okay too.
Absolutely. I mean, well, while we're talking about some of the things that clearly leave red traces, unintentionally or otherwise, what are the sort of traces that great leaders leave that strengthen organizations? The ones that you look at and you go, well, there's a strong green in there.
Yeah. Funny old thing, listening. That we said at the start. But, you know, one of the absolute strongest traces comes from what we call the guiding principle of notice. And that's just the ability to say thank you. The great Ken Blanchard, who's a big name in leadership management, many people will have read some of his books, has a phrase, catch people doing something right. And that leaves such a massive green trace. Is to say thank you and call someone out for doing something exceptional.
Yeah, it's that appreciation in the moment.
Maybe not exceptional, just doing their job well. Now, there's an interesting nuance in this that so we use the phrase know the team, cohere the team, lead the team. If you know the team well, you will know that you will have some people who will appreciate being called out and thanked in public, but you might also have a couple of very deep introverts who will hate being called out and thanked in public. And ironically, you will then send a green, but it'll be received as a red.
Yeah.
So it's that knowledge of, right, Adam, can I just have a quick word? And we'll go off to one side and I say, I see what you did there. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you. And then, you're welcome. Thanks very much. Bit of, you know, flushed cheeks, bit of embarrassment, but not that I want the world to open up under my feet because you've just called me out in front of everybody, even though it's with the best of intentions. So there's a nuance in there around knowing your people to a much greater level than a lot of leaders already do.
Yeah, there was a great phrase that somebody hammered into me fairly early on. They said, it's not about treating people the way you want to be treated. It's about treating the people the way that they want to be treated.
Correct. And you can only do that when you know them, right?
Yeah, and it's a phrase that's really stuck with me. It's one of the reasons why I love these psychological profiles, because then you can begin to understand, okay, that explains why when I did that thing, you really hated it when I thought you would have loved it.
Yeah. And they're great vehicles, aren't they, to talk about difference. And whether you believe that it's green, red, blue, yellow, you know, whatever it is, whether you go fully into that particular mechanism or not, is largely irrelevant. It demonstrates that there is difference and it opens the door for that conversation to happen.
Well, one of the things I'd love to do on that note then is to bring this philosophy of yours to life and actually get you to run through sort of some of the key questions you ask and some of the key values in it as well, Paul.
Okay. So we tend to, I mean, if we're looking at how the question set that we ask and the domains that we explore in the analysis and diagnosis phase, there are kind of 6 what we call domains that we look at. So the first one is direction and clarity, because so many organizations give direction, but they're not actually giving clarity along with it. And that requires people to communicate in a range of different ways, rather than the way that we want to, exactly as you just said, rather than communicate in my default way. How do I need to communicate this message and give this direction in order that everyone hears it and understands it?
Yeah.
That's really important. The second one is decision-making in practice. And that's how it looks at, one element of it is how much information and data does the leader take on before they make a decision? how much collaboration, how much interaction, how much discussion is there beforehand where appropriate. So again, we start to look at that two-way communication rather than just tell from the top down. We look at that. Let's get the data in, because that's going to make a broader, richer, deeper decision afterwards. So that's the second one. The third one is day-to-day leadership behavior. And that's all about the behavior that one leader has with the one led in contact. So how much do they listen, actively listen to what you're talking about? How accessible are they? They might come out with that slightly cliched term of "my door is always open."
But is it really?
And it is, because it's open plan office. But what micro behaviors do you pick up on when you go and say, "Paul, can I just speak to you a minute?" And I raise my eyebrows, I sigh, I look at my watch, I breathe deeply, which is a sigh, isn't it? And you pick up on the fact that actually I'm not wanted here, I'm interrupting. And sometimes you will be, but there's ways and means of overcoming that as a leader.
Yeah.
So those are the top three. I can go into the other three if that would be useful, the other three domains that we look at.
Yeah, I think to understand the breadth, because I think one of the things that happens, I think, with CTOs, especially those who are coming into senior and executive leadership for the first time, is what am I unaware of? What are the kind of impacts I have that I don't know even to look out for? And I think the three you've just listed there probably rank relatively highly, but I think the other three will be a bit of that sort of breadth and depth that some of them are probably, if not ignorant of, then slightly less aware of than they could be.
Yeah. We look at performance and accountability. So how well do they set the standard that they expect in others?
Right.
Can you mirror their behavior and still progress in the organization? Because a lot of times, and I mean more than 50% of the times, if you mirror the senior leader's behavior in an organization, you won't progress, because there seems to be this ceiling that some people get to, that it's then do as I say, not as I do. And that happens at a shocking amount in organizations. So it's that, how do they perform? Do they give you regular feedback as well? How open and transparent are they with their own behaviors? And are they a role model? As well as, how do they help you to become a leader in the organization?
Right. So
it's interesting that you mentioned executive leaders a moment ago, because to become an executive leader in an organization requires quite a significant mindset shift from what got you there, because you're a different type of team at that point.
And that's one of the key things, isn't it? Is when you join a more senior team, every time there's that temptation to think of your team as being the people you are leading, rather than the people who are your peers in that team.
Absolutely.
So Patrick Lencioni, one of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Yeah.
Absolutely that. Yeah. Great author. And the fifth one is trust and psychological safety, which we've spoken quite a lot about today. And that's, can Adam come and speak to Paul without any fear of retribution, without being taken off at the knees? And actually, how much do you trust me? Because I suspect we have probably all worked for someone that you are not going to go and tell them something, because it's either going to go around the organization really quickly, it's going to be used to judge you with. And so I often listen, and we often listen for organizations. If people are coming into work and talking about things that are going on at home, that is a great organization.
Because it denotes that kind of safety and the trust.
There's an element of vulnerability there.
Right.
Whereas if people aren't talking about what's going on at home, that is at a very functional, foundational level. That's because they don't trust people enough to share what's going on in their private life. And if you don't have that social interaction, that emotional interaction at work, you might as well say goodbye to the functional interactions as well, because it's based on a foundation of sound at best.
So that's a strong bellwether then, is whether people feel comfortable enough to talk about things from outside the workplace in the workplace.
Yeah. And you're not going to talk to everybody. That's unrealistic. You're not going to talk to everybody about everything.
But if there's no chatter at all,
people in exactly
right?
Do you have people in the workplace who you're going to go and have your lunch with and chat to, and ask how they are in the morning and genuinely give them the answer, rather than I'm fine, or that how are you, busy? No, I didn't ask that. I asked how are you. So those throw away. So those are the top 5. And then the 6th one is development and enablement, i.e. what it says on the tin. How open are those leaders to developing their team and enabling their team to progress in terms of CPD, in terms of proper leadership development, mentoring, coaching, that ability to almost catch up and overtake you? Because there will be talent in organizations that exceeds the talent that is higher in it. And therefore, if we identify that, we should almost graciously step to one side and allow them to go on and be the superstars, rather than begrudgingly try and elbow them out because that's the job that you want. Now, how realistic that is, I realise that might be slightly rose-tinted spectacles on my part, but why not?
And I think it does depend on the greater culture of the organization, doesn't it? There are some where getting ahead is everything. Other organizations where actually you want the best idea to win. You want the best leaders to stand forward and do so relatively naturally and organically. But a cultural organization is one where that latter scenario is standard. It's normal. It's expected.
Yeah, sure. And also, it's a very rare organization that promotes someone and realizes, we've actually put them one stage too far or too soon, and allows them to step back down again without fear of judgment. And I get the challenges with that because, you move one egg from one egg cup to the next. You've got to get a new egg to fill the old egg cup. Otherwise, you've got a gap in capability. But why not do it for a trial period? If you promote, especially if you promote just on technical competence or longevity, Paul's been around for a long time, we better make him a director. Well, Paul's not a very good leader, so you don't want him as a director in the organization. And also, if Paul is the best programmer and you make him the chief programmer, you've now got a chief programmer who doesn't lead and has no leadership capability. But you've also got a double whammy because you've just lost your best programmer as well.
One of these, what's called the Peter principle, isn't it? Where people are promoted beyond their level of competence. And that could be because they haven't been coached or trained or because it's a different role.
Yeah, absolutely. So we should always try where possible to prepare people for the next role before we put them in there. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But this is where Dacto app comes in, because if you measure leadership capability of line managers the whole way through the organization consistently, then you get near-time results on leadership capability. And therefore, the succession plan writes itself, because you get someone who is, if you need them to be technically competent, and often you don't as a leader, so you want a good enabler rather than a good doer in a leadership appointment. And if they can do some doing and they understand how the doing is done, if that's not too complicated a tongue twister, then you get there. But you want to promote people with leadership capability. And you might wish to take a hit on technical capability in order to get the best leaders. So we use the phrase that we uncover how leadership is experienced, not how it's intended. And that is often a very different picture.
And is it, if an organization has a leader and that leader says, well, I'd like to know how I lead, is it as simple as them going to each of the people and saying, how do I lead? Or is it more important that there is an element of indirection in there where that they don't necessarily, they can be confident that the feedback and the answers they're giving aren't going to be immediately given to that leader and therefore be used against them effectively?
Yeah, great. Anonymity is fundamentally important in what we do. So our app will send out an email to the person. So, the system will understand that it's come from Adam's email address, but the system anonymizes that on the way into the data. So if we chose to, we as the people who own the app, we could find out who's done it, but we don't need to. So there is absolutely a requirement for anonymity, because that overcomes the risk of low levels of psychological safety.
Yeah.
Because if you could trace back the breadcrumb trail to Paul said that, Adam said that Paul is an absolute chump and leaves deep reds everywhere, well, that could result in a career-limiting moment for Adam.
Which you clearly want to avoid, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. But this is about what we do is we identify, it's not because there are mechanisms in organizations to report bullying, harassment, and spiky activity and whistleblow. And those should exist and they should be absolutely upheld by the organization. What we do is we identify themes and trends, because thematic awareness is important in the leadership domain rather than individuals. individual activities, because you don't want to change an entire organization's behaviors and cultures because of one individual spike of activity. You want to do it based on thematic awareness.
Excellent. I think this is probably a really good point then to sort of wrap up and summarize, because one of the things you've actually got available for our listeners today is a manifesto that they can go and download. And we'll put a link into the show notes for that. But just as we do that, it'd be great if you just sort of, because there's 7 topics in there. If you could just quickly list through those 7 so people know what they're going to get. And we can have a quick chat about that.
Yeah. So this is called the Forensic Leadership Manifesto. And it's called a manifesto because if you pledge to do just one of these things, by tomorrow, you will be a better leader. If you do all of them, then you will be a better leader than most leaders across most sectors. Yes, it is. And it is true. So the first one is that great leadership comes from a position of care. That is my central philosophy of leadership. And I would contend that if you don't care about those people around you, you're not leading them. You might be managing them, and you might be managing them really well, but you're not leading them, because people come to people when they're cared for. And I'm not the only person to say it. Theodore Roosevelt said, "No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care." So this has been around for a long time, but great leadership comes from a position of care, and it's the central philosophy of my approach. The second one is be the leader others need, and that is not the one they want.
Right.
And some people go, well, how do I know what they need? Well, just stop for a second and either speak to them about what they need in the moment, but if that feels uncomfortable, put yourself back in their position. Who did you need when you were in their position? Or do you think you would have needed if you've never been in their position? And start with that if you can't ask them for some reason. The third one is be the leader others turn to. And this is the epitome of psychological safety. If people come to you with problems and challenges and worries and concerns and challenges, because opposition can be loyal, and that's really important to identify, that if people are turning to you, and you'll know that because when things go wrong, they'll come to you rather than go to someone else, then that's really important. You want people to raise issues with you because as a leader, you have a duty of care for those under your charge, for their well-being.
And this is a really interesting point, because this is one of the ones where I often identify the unofficial leaders in an organization. Those are people without the title, but are the ones that others turn to. Those are the people who are trusted and often a good candidate for next leadership levels.
Yeah, exactly. And if you go around a table of leaders and say, any issues in your team, the one who's constantly going, no issues, are you leading then? That's a good thermostat, if you like. The fourth one is forensic leaders have one eye on the horizon and one eye on the detail. You can't wholly be a strategic leader because you need to understand what's going on the coalface. And this is, notice, like I said earlier on, you've got to notice the micro behaviours of what's going on in the team. Because if you're just setting the direction and not noticing that someone's going, really? Or rolling their eyes every time a female member of staff speaks and a male member of staff rolls their eyes, that's a problem, right? So you've got to look at these micro behaviours, but also you've got to set the direction. So you've got to have an eye on the horizon and see opportunities when they arise and see problems before they, become the snapping crocodile at the edge of the canoe. You want to see them a long way off. So you've got to look at the horizon and see the opportunities and the problems as well as the detail. And that comes from when I did the All Arms Commando course in the British Army. One of the corporals, the directing staff on that, I was an officer, they were a corporal. So again, they were calling me sir, but they were more knowledgeable than I was. Always keep an eye on the detail, sir, because it's the detail that will kill you. Again, one of those anchored points in your memory that you remember. Hopefully your listeners won't forget that slightly jeopardy.
No, but I think there is an element here whereas the duality of that expression is important, because I think what I find with a lot of engineering leaders, technical leaders, they've risen up from the detail. So they start with the detail, the default is the detail.
Yeah.
And therefore, as they get into more senior leadership positions, remembering that strategy is now part of their role is actually the challenge for many of them. And so ensuring they do have one eye looking up at least every now and again is, I find, the harder side of that one for them. So it's an interesting
point. And you can stifle other people by working down, and therefore they've got no space to operate. So that's a really important point. The fifth element is forensic leaders are conscious, deliberate, and intentional. And what does that mean? It means they don't act impulsively. They don't panic when there's a crisis on. They slow down and they start to think, mainly because the team mirrors the behaviours of the leader, especially in times of crisis.
Yes.
You're running around flapping with your head on fire. They're going to start flapping as well, and nothing productive is going to get done, and you're going to deepen the crisis. So what behaviours or words do I need to demonstrate or use in order to have the impact that I want to have? And often, especially in crisis, it's about that time of just stepping back, taking a breath, and going, okay, we're in crisis. Let's normalize the crisis, understand we're in crisis. Let's gather data, like we've spoken about a couple of times already, and then let's give some direction. And that direction can change. There's no problem with changing direction because you're only acting with the data you've got available at the time, and the context changes, the situation changes.
And as more facts come up, it changes. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely, the direction changes. The sixth one is forensic leaders are storytellers. You've encouraged me today to tell stories, to paint that picture, to paint the compelling jigsaw puzzle, if you like.
Was that obvious?
So, not at all. What it does, storytelling creates an emotional bond. And we're not talking like, is everyone sitting comfortably, Jack and Ori once upon a time? We're talking about an emotional bond. The human brain thinks in pictures. We dream in pictures. We don't dream in numbers. So the closest thing we can do to get a compelling narrative and help people understand what part they play in the plan is to tell a story and make that aspirational, inspirational, transparent. And people can then go, right, I get it, because that story paints the picture. Numbers are not particularly aspirational or inspirational. They're transparent, and there's got to be metrics. Of course, there's got to be metrics in terms of measures of success and all that kind of stuff. But the vision statement, that key message, that narrative, the intent, the purpose, the why, should be really compelling words. And I'm going to just touch back in my own career history. There's a point in the military orders process where the commander will, I'll pick one up now. The commander will pick up their notepad and go, right, my intent is to. So they close the notepad, they look at everyone broadly in the eye and say, it is my intent that we will do the following. And it's called the commander's intent of the orders process. And everyone goes, I get it. Because you paint the picture, you tell the story. So it's not once upon a time. This is about a compelling narrative.
The point you had before about being deliberate and intentional, that was one of those things that struck me, is that intentional sort of means having a purpose, being deliberate, but there is an intent there. There is a thing that we're going to do or an outcome that we're going to deliver. And that's basically the point of the storytelling, is to make that really clear and obvious. My first memory of that was actually, funnily enough, by somebody who was ex-military as well. I was 12 years old in the Swiss Alps, because that's where I was at the time at school. And he was sort of teaching us how to read a map and do basic orienteering. But he pulled out the map and plunked it down, kind of trying to be funny, but also giving us a message. We are here. The enemy is here, here, and here. We need to get to here. And I will never forget it, because it was dead simple. We're there. We need to get to there. And as he pointed out, the enemy was pointing out that there was one cliff, there was one very steep hill on the other side of it. And so he just made it really obvious. This is where we're going, what we're going to do. And it's exactly that thing of, okay, it's not just we're going to walk along this path and go up there. It was a memorable, impactful, short story. Boom. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to one of the fundamentals of forensic leadership around make it accessible for everybody. And if they understand the story, the intent, the purpose, the vision, the mission, whatever you want to call it, then that is sustainable, because everyone will go, right, I know where we're at now. We're at that corner, we're at that cliff, we're at the lake, on your map analogy. I know where we are, so I know how far we've still got to go. So that's really important.
Absolutely.
And then the final element of the Forensic Leadership Manifesto, and it's fitting that it is the last one, is that forensic leaders speak last.
It was the only place you could go on the list, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. They don't always speak last. We've spoken about crisis, and sometimes in crisis or time critical or time sensitive, the leader needs to give direction. It's right, you do that, and there's no place for discussion. But they want to be really rare times, because the beauty of speaking last is that you get to hear everybody's thoughts and opinions around the table. And you get, say, for example, there's 7 people around the table plus you. You get 8 brains on the task at hand, rather than going, right, everyone, I think we should do this. What do you think? They'll go, yeah. You might get the odd brave one who'll push against you and challenge. But in general terms, you then have the opportunity to say, Adam, that was after everyone has spoken. So a friend of mine talks about this thing called ESOBAST, which is everyone speaks once before anyone speaks twice.
Okay, right. That's a
which
nice one.
I quite like that. And you go around the table, get everyone to speak once, and that affords the leader not only the opportunity to think and reflect and start to develop their plan, but also go back around the table. Adam, that was brilliant. That's really aligned to what I was thinking. Green trace left. Everyone witnesses the green trace. That becomes a green ripple. Then go around the table. Emily, that was a great point. I hadn't thought of that, but we're definitely going to bring that into the future plan. Co-creation is really valuable. Secondly, green trace to Emily. Everyone's witnessed it. Green ripple. Everyone's starting to go, I've got permission to speak. I can challenge. I can come up with something that doesn't align to Paul's thinking, and he might well take it on. And then there might be an individual at the table, George, that's my son's name. George, that's a great idea, but we're not going to take it on for this particular plan for the following reasons. So I've heard it, I respect it, I've listened to what you've said, and I'm letting you down gently on this occasion. So I'm trying to make that interaction as green as possible. And I haven't gone, that's a ridiculous idea, don't be stupid, because then no one is going to speak again.
Yeah, there's an element of coaching in there as well. I think about it in this way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you want to carry that conversation on in private with George afterwards. And look, if you just elevate your thinking in the following way, that's great. But of course, if you consistently say to George, that's a great idea, but we're not going to take it on. It's a great idea, but we're not going to take it on. It doesn't take many iterations of that before George taps out and goes, do you know what? I'm done. I'm not going to put any more ideas on. So it's really important to follow up and allow that person to understand, George in this case, why you haven't taken that on and what they perhaps need to do to broaden their thinking. So that's the Forensic Leadership Manifesto. Do one of them by tomorrow, you'll be a better leader. Do them all, and you'll be a better leader than most others across most sectors.
Yeah, I can see that would put you in the top few percentage of leaders, definitely from my experience, that's for sure. Excellent. Paul, thank you very much for that. How can people get a hold of this? And how can people get a hold of you to continue the conversation if they'd like to?
Cool. Well, I've given you a link to the ebook, which people can access and download for free. They can get the overall book, Forensic Leadership: The Traces We Leave Behind, on Amazon. That's paperback and Kindle. Audio book is coming soon. I can't quantify what soon means. I've got to finish recording it.
Read by you, I heard, yes.
It is read by me, yeah. So if you haven't heard enough of my voice, then you get the audio book at some point. There are two ways of getting in touch with me, really. One is through LinkedIn, Paul Kinkaid, 2 Ks in Kinkaid. And the other one is paul@forensicoutcomes.com.
Excellent. We'll put links to both of those in the show notes. Paul, thank you very much today. It's been wonderful to talk to you. One of the things I love asking people just before they go, it's slightly out of the blue question, but it's a fun one. If you were to meet a CTO who just steps into the role, perhaps for the first time in an executive leadership role, and you to give them one tip, what would that be?
Be deliberate in what you do. So it goes to the conscious, deliberate, and intentional, but be deliberate. Deliberately wait before speaking. Deliberately gather data. And then speak deliberately about what you've seen and what you intend to do in the future. Because that brings gravitas, it brings leadership presence. It demonstrates that you're taking yourself seriously and the organization seriously and the people around you seriously. Be deliberate.
Wonderful advice. Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.